just say it costs $100 billion. What is that to the average American taxpayer? Do you have any idea?
Well, unlike foolish previous administrations, it won't go on.
No, I'm just asking.
For years and decades.
But let's just say
sitting
it's
in this
$100 billion.
position, it's hard to imagine how
you know
it was
that?
allowed those things to happen. You were a part
you
of
know
that
the
war.
answer to that?
So was I. And I never.
I'm just asking if you know what your war costs the average American taxpayer.
What happened in this hearing was not just a debate about Iran. It was not just another Washington argument about military strategy, national security, or who sounds tougher on television. No. What Congressman Seth Moulton exposed was something far more uncomfortable. He exposed the oldest scam in Washington foreign policy. Leaders talk about war like it is strength, strategy, and destiny, until someone asks who owns the decision, who pays the bill, and who gets buried under the consequences. And the moment Moulton started asking those questions, the confident war narrative began to wobble. Because suddenly, this was not about slogans. It was about ownership. It was about cost. It was about whether the same people who speak casually about confrontation are prepared to look the American people in the eye and say, yes, this is my war. Yes, I recommended it. Yes, I know what it costs. And yes, I will be accountable if it goes wrong. That is the real hearing. Not Iran, not deterrence, not another polished Pentagon answer. The real hearing was this. Are the people pushing America toward another Middle East war actually willing to carry the moral, financial, and political weight of what they are doing? And from the very first exchange, the answer became disturbingly clear.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you and I agree that Iran is a national security threat to us and our allies. Now, earlier you called us feckless for questioning your war. Do you think Congress was smart or feckless when it failed to ask tough questions of the Bush administration and gave them a blank check for Iraq?
Well, if you're trying to compare this war to the Iraq
I'm just asking
war,
you, do you think it was
smart
smart or
the
feckless?
first one to call a stupid war, then it's a false comparison.
Okay, well, probably a good idea to ask tough questions. So let me just ask you a few questions. Did you advise the president that we should attack Iran?
We were, first of all, in this position in the cabinet, we never talk about what we would advise the president to do or not.
Do you think the president or you deserve more?
I've been in every meeting.
I understand
with
that,
the chairman
Mr.
and
Secretary.
everybody else as those
Mr. Secretary,
critical
I'm asking
decisions
the
were
questions.
made, and he got every perspective possible when it came.
I'm
to
just asking what your perspective is. Are you afraid to take ownership of this? Do you think it was a good idea or not?
As I've consulted the president, do I think it's a good idea to confront a nuclear bomb
To start this
in the
war.
hands of the? Imagine what the world would look like right now if Iran had a nuclear weapon.
Okay, so let's
just imagine.
Which, by the way,
if
every
they
other,
had one,
every
which the
previous
Obama deal was
administration,
going to allow them
including
to do.
the first Trump administration,
they had one.
prevented them from having a nuclear weapon. So
Moulton
listen,
begins by going straight at the historical wound Washington never once reopened: Iraq. He reminds the secretary that earlier in the hearing, lawmakers questioning the war were called feckless. Then he asks the obvious question: was Congress smart or feckless when it failed to ask tough questions before giving the Bush administration a blank check for Iraq? That question immediately changes the atmosphere. This is no longer about sounding tough. It is about responsibility. Moulton then asks a simple question. Did you advise the president to attack Iran? Not a classified question, not an operational question, just ownership. And suddenly, the answer becomes much harder to give. The secretary retreats into process, saying cabinet officials do not discuss private advice given to the president. This is where Moulton establishes the central theme of the hearing. He is not arguing that Iran is harmless. He openly acknowledges Iran is a threat. What he is challenging is the idea that national security should exempt leaders from accountability. The secretary is willing to defend the operation. He is willing to call it successful. He is willing to criticize skeptics. But when asked whether he personally recommended the action beforehand, the certainty disappears. That matters politically, because if a military operation is truly an overwhelming success, ownership should not be difficult. Yet throughout modern American history, officials often become most cautious when asked to attach their own names to decisions that could carry enormous consequences. That is exactly the contradiction Moulton exposes. Ordinary Americans should pay attention to this dynamic. Before wars begin, officials speak with confidence. After costs emerge, the language becomes far more complicated. Responsibility gets spread around. Mistakes become collective. Predictions become misunderstandings. And the people left carrying the burden are often taxpayers, military families, and working Americans. That is why ownership matters. If leaders cannot clearly own a decision at the beginning, there is little reason to believe they will fully own the consequences at the end. But Moulton was only getting started. Once ownership became unclear, he moved to the next question every administration fears. If this is such a success, what does winning actually
Having a
look
nuclear
like?
weapon. So, listen, how is this war going? Do you think we're winning?
Militarily on the battlefield, it's been an astounding military success.
No, but are we winning the war?
Absolutely.
Okay, so do you call Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz winning?
Well, I would say the blockade that we hold that doesn't allow anything to come in or out of Iranian ports, which
Okay,
is
so
always in our
we've blockaded
portfolio
their
to
blockade. So
use.
they blockaded us, and then we blockaded their blockade. That's like saying, tag, you're it. Or, you know, if President Madison had said, well, the British just burned down Washington, but don't worry, we're going to burn it down as well.
Moulton asks how the war is going. The secretary responds that militarily, it has been an astounding success. Moulton follows up, are we winning? The answer is immediate. Absolutely. Then Moulton introduces the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has disrupted one of the most important shipping choke points in the world. The secretary argues that if Iran blockades, the United States can respond in kind. Moulton highlights the weakness in that logic. A reciprocal blockade is not necessarily a strategy. It may simply be escalation. This is where the hearing shifts from rhetoric to outcomes. Washington often uses the word winning without defining it. A successful strike can be called winning. A destroyed target can be called winning. A confident press conference can be called winning. But Moulton asks a more difficult question. If global shipping is disrupted, energy markets are threatened, and the conflict expands beyond its original objectives, what exactly has been won? This distinction matters. Tactical success is not the same thing as strategic victory. A military operation can succeed in the short term while creating larger problems in the long term. That was one of the central lessons of Iraq. It was one of the central lessons of Afghanistan. And that is why Moulton brought Iraq into the conversation from the beginning, not as a slogan, as evidence, as a warning against confusing immediate military achievements with lasting strategic success. The Strait of Hormuz is not an abstract foreign policy issue. Its consequences reach directly into everyday life. Energy prices affect transportation. Transportation affects shipping. Shipping affects consumer prices. What begins as a military discussion can quickly become an economic burden for millions of families. The people making these decisions may debate strategy in briefing rooms, but ordinary Americans experience the consequences through higher costs and greater uncertainty. That is why defining victory matters, because if leaders cannot clearly explain what success looks like, the public has no way to measure whether the sacrifices being demanded are justified. And then Moulton pushes even further. If victory is being declared, was the administration actually prepared for the consequences that followed?
Chairman Kane, did the military have plans for the idea that Iran might blockade the strait?
Sure. Thanks for the question. I'll answer it this way. You know, in this job, I have to maintain trust with a variety of constituents. To
Okay, I'm
include
just
the president.
asking if the military
Yes,
had
sir.
plans.
As always, my point in this is, as I explain the role, my point in this is we always offer a full range of military options that are carefully considered with the associated risks with those options and the considerations therein.
So,
and we
Mr.
always
Secretary,
do that.
did you consider this risk?
Of course, this department has looked at all aspects of this risk. And
So then
because
why did you
this
send the
department looks,
minesweepers, the only minesweepers we had in the Gulf, to Singapore weeks before the war started.
We have lots of capabilities that you may or may not be aware of at the classified level.
Okay, and
to deal
so,
with, to deal with
by the way,
mines.
would the Trump-class battleships have helped with this?
You're talking about a
Minesweeping.
prospective future battleship, which we welcome in the fleet.
Okay, so you're supportive of the battleships.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Moulton
much is a-
asks whether the military planned for Iran potentially blockading the Strait of Hormuz. Chairman Kaine explains that military leaders provide options, risks, and assessments. The secretary insists the department considered all relevant risks, but Moulton points to a striking detail. Reports indicated that the only minesweepers in the Gulf had been moved to Singapore before the conflict. The secretary responds by emphasizing that the United States possesses many capabilities that cannot be discussed publicly. Moulton then delivers a sarcastic jab about whether Trump-class battleships would have solved the problem. This exchange is important because it tests the difference between capability and preparedness. The administration argues that it has options. Moulton asks whether foreseeable risks were addressed before they became realities. Those are not the same thing. Having military capabilities does not automatically prove adequate planning. And throughout the hearing, a pattern begins to emerge. First, ownership becomes difficult to establish. Then, victory is declared without a clear definition. Now, planning questions are met with assurances that the public cannot fully evaluate because the details remain classified. Perhaps those capabilities exist, but democratic oversight cannot function entirely on trust. Officials asking for public support, congressional backing, and taxpayer funding must also be willing to answer difficult questions about preparation and risk. That is the accountability Moulton is demanding. Americans have heard similar assurances before. They are told risks were considered. They are told experts have everything under control. They are told the plan is solid. Then, years later, costs rise, missions expand, and assumptions prove weaker than advertised. The consequences are not theoretical. They affect budgets, debt, public priorities, and future generations. Questions about minesweepers and shipping lanes may sound technical, but they are really questions about whether leaders anticipated the consequences of the decisions they made. And that leads directly to the issue Washington often avoids most aggressively: the price tag. After ownership, victory, and planning, Moulton moves to the question that brings every war down to earth. Who pays for it?
How much has Iran profited from your administration lifting the sanctions on Iran when you started this war?
I can tell you Iran is financially devastated right now.
Okay, well,
in conjunction with the
they've
Treasury
earned about
and
$14 billion.
Operation Economic Fury. They're at a point where between the blockade and what we've done to them militarily, remember, they don't have a Navy. They can't contest the blockade.
Okay.
Between what we've done to them
What kind of
militarily
a
and
Navy can
financially,
they buy
they're at
for
a place
$14 billion?
where they have very few options.
How many Chinese missiles can they buy for $14 billion? Does that sound like winning?
They're not. We're ensuring, and they're not buying Chinese missiles.
Okay. You know, at the end of the day, this also has a cost to us. If let's say this war costs $100 billion, I mean, you've already said, give us more time. It's only been 2 months. It could go on for 20 years like Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's just say it costs $100 billion. What is that to the average American taxpayer? Do you have any idea?
Well, unlike foolish previous administrations, it won't go on.
No, I'm just asking.
For years and decades.
But let's just say
sitting
it's
in
$100
this position,
billion.
it's hard to imagine how
You know
it was
that?
allowed those things to happen. You were a part
You
of
know
that
the
war.
answer to that?
So was I. I never.
I'm
knew
just
what the end
asking if
state
you know what
clearly
your
was.
war
Now I
costs
know
the
what
average
end
American
state is.
taxpayer.
What is the cost of Iran having a nuclear weapon that they wield?
I'm
over
just
us?
asking if you know the cost of the average American
I'm asking
taxpayer.
you what the
It's about
cost would be of
$600.
that.
So for the American taxpayers out there, my constituents, some of the constituents you wanted to represent in Minnesota, I'm just wondering if they have an extra $600 lying around to pay for your war. I think that's just a question that we ought to ask. Now, quickly, on March 13th in a press conference, you said, we will give them no quarter, no mercy. In order for no quarter or no survivors is a war crime under the Geneva Conventions. You understand that's murder. Do you stand by that statement?
The Department of War fights to win, and we ensure that our warfighters have the rules of engagement necessary to be as
Okay,
effective
so
as
just to
humanly
be clear,
possible,
you
which
called
they are.
Democratic members of Congress to be tried for sedition for reminding our troops to follow the law. But when you tell them to commit a war crime, you stand by yourself.
For insinuating that the
Congratulations,
laws that
Mr.
we're giving
Secretary.
them are
Gentleman's
unlawful.
time's
What a
expired.
breakdown.
Chair now recognizes
Moulton raises the possibility that the conflict could ultimately cost $100 billion. The secretary rejects comparisons to Iraq and Afghanistan and insists this situation is different. Moulton then asks whether the secretary knows what a $100 billion war would cost the average taxpayer. Rather than answer directly, the secretary returns to the threat posed by Iran. So Moulton supplies the number himself, roughly $600 per taxpayer. Then he asks the question that cuts through every strategic abstraction. Do your constituents have an extra $600 lying around to pay for your war? The hearing suddenly becomes personal. The war now has a receipt. Moulton then pushes into another area of accountability. He cites comments about giving enemies no quarter, no mercy, and raises concerns about wartime rhetoric, the Geneva Conventions, and the standards expected of senior officials. The discussion becomes larger than military strategy. It becomes a debate about responsibility, legality, and the example leaders set during. This is the emotional center of the hearing. Washington often discusses war through the language of strategy, deterrence, containment, force posture, regional stability. Moulton translates all of it into household economics. That changes the frame entirely. Most Americans do not experience war through policy papers. They experience it through taxes, inflation, energy costs, debt, and long-term obligations. The $600 figure is powerful because it forces the discussion into everyday reality. And when pressed on costs, the response repeatedly returns to danger. That is understandable politically. Threats are emotionally compelling, costs are measurable, and measurable costs create accountability. The same dynamic appears in the discussion about wartime rhetoric. Leaders often demand trust and loyalty, but accountability requires scrutiny. If officials expect Congress and the public to support military action, questions about legality, conduct, and moral responsibility cannot be dismissed as disloyalty. Those questions are part of democratic oversight. A family struggling with rising prices does not casually absorb another $600 expense. A retiree living on a fixed income does not view that cost as abstract. A worker balancing rent, healthcare, and debt does not experience war as a strategic concept. They experience it as another burden. That is why this hearing resonated. Not because national security is unimportant, not because Iran poses no threat, but because Moulton repeatedly forced the conversation back to consequences. Who recommended the action? What does victory mean? Was the planning adequate? What will it cost? And what standards govern the conduct of those leading the effort? Those are not radical questions. They are the basic questions Congress is supposed to ask before the bill arrives. By the end of the exchange, every issue pointed back to the same underlying problem: ownership, accountability, consequences. And that is the real story of this hearing. Here is my final judgment. This hearing exposed an administration that appears far more comfortable defending a war than fully owning every aspect of it. It wants to project confidence. It wants to claim success. It wants public trust. But Moulton repeatedly forced the discussion back to accountability. Who recommended this? What does winning mean? Were the risks anticipated? What will it cost? And what responsibilities come with the rhetoric used to justify it? That is why this exchange mattered, because it was never just about Iran. It was about a broader political culture that often treats skepticism as weakness and oversight as inconvenience. A culture that remembers past mistakes selectively. A culture that asks ordinary Americans to absorb costs while demanding faith in decisions they had no role in making. The most important lesson from this hearing is simple. In a democracy, questioning leaders before a conflict expands is not disloyal. It is essential. Congress exists to ask difficult questions before consequences become irreversible. And Seth Moulton spent this hearing asking exactly those questions. Judging by the discomfort in the room, that may be precisely why the exchange mattered.